Dobrodošli u Podcast Mrežnica i dobrodošli u još jedan online podcast. Razlog je vrlo jednostavan. Naš današnji gost je norveški profesor Diesen. Profesor je političkih znanosti čiji je fokus rada geoekonomija, potom euroazijske integracije, ali i ruska vanjska politika. Profesor je na norveškom sveučilištu na kojem se obrazuje više od 17.000 studenata. Trenutno je jedan od najcitiranijih i najčešćih gostiju svjetskih podcasta u kojima progovara o trenutnoj geopolitičkoj situaciji, šahovskoj igri kojoj svjedočimo, ali i budućem mogućem razvoju situacije. Objavio je knjigu Ukrajinski rat i euroazijski poredak u kojoj analizira trenutak u kojem sada živimo. Profesor Diesen danas u podcastu Mrežnica govori o greškama Europe, budućnosti Ukrajine, odnosima sa Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama, Kinom, ali i budućnosti zbog koje je pomalo pesimističan. Neka ovo bude još jedan naš doprinos razumijevanju situacije u kojoj živimo, a kao i uvijek ostavljamo vam da razmišljate svojom glavom. Professor Diesen, welcome to our podcast. It is an honor to have you with us today.
No, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be on.
The world order is rapidly changing. Sometimes it seems like we are living in a geopolitical thriller. The rare minerals deal is done. Who are the winners and who are the losers?
Well, I think the US would be, possibly a winner. It really depends, because the objective behind this mineral deal between the Americans and the Ukrainians are obviously Americans want to get some of their money back, and even then some. And the Ukrainians are attempting to get America entangled into Ukraine, that is, to prevent it from walking away. So this is the deal. So at the moment, it looks as if the Americans are simply going to get a lot of the resources, and without giving any security guarantees or committing themselves. So it looks like this is a win for the US and a loss for Ukraine, because a lot of these resources are quite important when it wants to restore, has to recover after the war. But this being said, if the US is actually pulled in further into Ukraine and makes it harder to disentangle, then it could be a loss for everyone. So it remains to be seen. But at the time being, it looks as if it's more of a traditional colonial purge, if you will, of Ukraine.
Why does the USA avoid giving guarantees?
Well, often it sounds wonderful, security guarantees. We say, it creates a deterrent. It will warn the Russians that they can't take any military measurements against the Ukrainians. But it's worth noting that security guarantees also trigger larger wars. That is, if a war is started and this pulls in the United States, then we're effectively in deep trouble. And the United States can either fail to live up to its security guarantee, and then it will have its credibility shattered, or it can actually follow through on the security guarantee, and it will trigger possibly World War III with nuclear exchange. So giving security guarantees is always sold in the media as something positive, but it is very, very dangerous as well. And often it's all premised on this idea that the Russians are simply, looking to take all of Ukraine. Now, I would say that any peace would require something more, something that can mitigate the security competition, because NATO and Russia has undermined each other's security here. So this have to be a solution in which all parties look at how we can enhance a common security, instead of one side simply threaten another one. And furthermore, just as a last point is, once you have, if you want a peace agreement, which is actually lasting, the most important thing is to create incentives for not restarting the conflict. And this is the most important thing, which is why it's always a good idea to have some economic cooperation or something which makes it, removes the incentives to restart the war. Now, if Ukraine wants to reconquer all its territories, defeat Russia on the battlefield, well, what does Ukraine need? Because it's exhausted. It needs the NATO to enter the war on Ukraine's side, irrespective of, possibility of a World War III. And by giving security guarantees, if Ukraine restarts the conflict, the Europeans are not going to criticize Zelensky for anything. Then the NATO, including the Americans, are pulled into this war. So Ukraine then has a huge incentive to restart the conflict. This is a huge concern which we should be discussing, but we're not, because it could be seen as, taking the side of Russia against Ukraine. So I think the absence of some objective assessment of this could result in us walking into a very difficult and dangerous situation. So I'm actually very critical of the whole concept of security guarantees.
Territories with rare minerals are in Russian hands. What will that look like?
Sorry, what will
that look like?
Well, this is something that the Russians could do, of course. Now, we've seen that when Zelensky tries to transfer a lot of natural resources to the United States however this mineral deal is formulated, the Russians have to some extent countered it. That is, Putin has suggested to Trump, we can work together and we can have a joint venture, so we can cooperate on energy extraction in Russia. Not just the territory Russia has annexed, but in the rest of Russia as well. And this is, of course, of great importance to the United States, because a lot of the rare earth minerals are concentrated in China. And the Americans and Chinese are in the middle of an economic conflict where the Americans started by cutting off the access to advanced chips and other services from the US and products. And the Chinese have a dominance on the mining and refinement on a lot of the resources the Americans need for their products, military, and across the board. So I think if the Russians can offer such a cooperation to the Americans, then it's very convincing. And it would, instead of being simply a purge or a theft, as we see now from the US taking from Ukraine, it would be an actual form of economic cooperation, something that could also create incentives for not reviving any conflicts. So it would be very different. But in terms of the resources of Ukraine, the vast majority of all of Ukraine's value are in the east. The vast majority of its natural resources, lithium, rare earth minerals, they're all concentrated in Donbas region. And the historical territories, which are Russian, everything from Kharkov to Odessa, but primarily in Donbas. And half of these resources are now under Russian control. So if America wants access to Ukrainian natural resources, this is effectively disputed territory now, given that the Russians are also claiming it. So they might have to work with the Russians instead. So this is the situation we're in. But it is problematic, and this is because, as I said, the historical Russian territories between Kharkov and Odessa, it's not just where the rare earth and natural resources are, oil, gas. It's also where you find the agriculture, the fertile black soil. It's where you find the strategic, a lot of the industries, which are also heavily focused in Donbas. Is also where you find the Black Sea coastline, which is to a large extent what this whole proxy war has been about. That is to pushing Russia out of the Black Sea. So there's everything of value is in this historical Russian territories, which is why it's a great interest for NATO to actually find a peace with Russia, because if we continue to threaten to expand NATO, telling the Russians that these historical Russian cities are either going to be in NATO territory or Russian territory, then I think the Russians will snatch everything from Kharkov to Odessa. The better thing would be to convince the Russians that we'll let Ukraine be neutral. In other words, this Odessa, Kharkov, they won't be Russian and they won't be in NATO, but they can be part of a neutral Ukraine. I think this is something all sides could live with, which would be the beneficial middle road.
So we can say that Ukraine is a victim again.
Well, I think it's quite obvious. The Russians have taken 20% of their territory. America wants to take half of their resources. And the Europeans, they insist that whatever manpower men Zelensky can snatch off the streets, they should send them to the front line to continue fighting Russia in a war that can't be won. So everyone wants something from the Ukrainians. So again, the US, Russians, Europeans, they're all using Ukraine. And this is a huge problem in a proxy conflict that is this has become very little to do with Ukraine, and it's a lot about great power rivalry. And Ukraine is being used, and everyone is speaking in the language that they're only there to help the Ukrainians. Again, the Russians saying, "Well, we want to help the Ukrainians who have been slaughtered by the Zelensky's government now and the Poroshenko government for 7-8 years." We want to help them. Of course, helping also means taking huge parts of their strategic territory. The Americans say, oh, we want to help the Ukrainians, but of course, going to get paid as well. The Europeans want to help Ukraine, but we also want to send and effectively fight down to the last Ukrainian. It's a lot of moralistic language and a lot of very dubious motivations behind it.
So what do you think? Will there be a ceasefire? Trump is talking about it, but the Russian side is not.
Yeah, this is the key question. How do you resolve a conflict? Because often one agrees, let's have a ceasefire, and then we find a political solution. The problem is we've done this before, and on this aspect, I think we in the West have to be honest that we deceived the Russians on this. And I point mainly then to the Minsk agreement from 2015. We said, let's have a ceasefire, and then we'll have the implementation of the political agreement. So Kiev had to start negotiating with Donbass. They had to accept some political autonomy. They needed the diplomacy. But as soon as the ceasefire was in place, the Western powers said, well, now we don't have to do that political settlement. We can just change realities on the ground. So from 2015 to 22, the Western powers instead begin to pump in a lot of military equipment. They began to train and equip a huge Ukrainian army consisting of hundreds of thousands of men. And the basic idea is we don't have to accept any of this. We'll implement the political settlement because we'll just change realities on the ground. This is why the main two countries who negotiated the Minsk agreement, which were the French and the Germans, they already admitted that the goal was not to implement the agreement, only buy time for Ukraine so they could build a huge army. So if you go back to the Russians now and we tell them, well, let's just have a ceasefire and we'll do the political discussions later. And ideally we'll put some NATO troops, or we call them European and American, but they will effectively be NATO troops to police the border. Then and then this will be an acceptable settlement. I think no. The Russians they already fallen for this. They're not going to do this one more time. But this makes, of course, the situation much more difficult, as happens when there's no trust anymore. So now the Russians demand a political settlement before the ceasefire takes place. Again, the whole concept of having peacekeepers as well is very problematic for them, because they see this primarily as being a proxy war between NATO and Russia. And now suddenly the NATO is going to have its own troops, overseeing the ceasefire on the Russian border. I mean, the Russians invaded to make sure NATO does not end up on this border, and now they're going to have NATO troops being peacekeepers. No, I think whatever hats they're wearing, I think it's not going to happen. And this is not to take the side of Russia, as the language we often have in Europe. It is just recognizing reality. There's no way the Russians would ever accept this. And this is why they won't accept a ceasefire before a political settlement either. And in contrast, the Europeans, such as the French, who would like to prevent negotiations, prevent diplomacy, and prolong the war, this is why Macron goes to Washington and sells this in. Yes, let's get a ceasefire, and then we can start discussions on political settlement. But the Europeans are already very clear. They're not going to accept anything. They demand the NATO expansion. They demand all territories, including Crimea, have to be returned to Ukraine. They demand having their own troops on Ukrainian soil. They don't want to put any pressure on Ukraine to restore very basic human rights, that is language rights, religious rights, political rights for the Russian speakers. So it's just a non-starter. And the fact that the Russians are this close to victory, that is the Ukrainian army is on the verge of collapse, the idea that they would accept another Minsk agreement, I think is preposterous. It's not going to happen.
So let's talk about warmongers. Have they moved to Europe now?
Yes, and this is a very strange development. And I keep making this point that it seems like the whole world is on the same page now. That is, who wants peace and negotiations, even accepting territorial concessions from the Ukrainian side. We see the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, even the majority of Ukrainians are willing to do a peace now, which involves transferring territories to Russia. Who's against this? It's only the Europeans. It looks like we're standing all alone now in this absolute demands that either we have all our demands met, or we won't even talk to the Russians. I mean, this is a very strange position to take, especially when we've lost this proxy war. So it's it is a bit of a puzzle, because in the past, the Europeans were always never able to stand up to America. In the past, perhaps, if we remember back in the 20 years ago with the invasion of Iraq, you had Germany, France, they all spoke up against the United States, which showed that they had some spine. But over the past 20 years, Europe has become more and more subservient to the US. And now that the US wants to end this conflict, now is the time for Europe apparently to start growing a spine and standing up to America. So now you have the Germans with the French and the British suggesting they'll form a new power bloc, but not for peace or constraining the US empire, but no, to prolong the war in Ukraine. It's very absurd, and I don't think the European leaders realize how it makes them look in the world, because they have convinced themselves that this is expression of their their moral principles, their how they're standing with Ukraine and all. But the rest of the world are looking at them almost as if they're savages, that they're willing to continue this slaughter. And it's very strange to me to see the EU, which began as a peace project, and again, for the past 3 years, whenever there's a conflict, the EU is always saying the same thing. Let's at least sit down and start talking. At least we get some mutual understanding. Maybe we're able to end the conflict. At least let's just start talking. This is always the solution when there's conflict in the world, except this time. For 3 years now, the Europeans just sat on the sideline and they watched hundreds of thousands of young men die, and they did nothing. They didn't even want to sit down and talk to the Russians. Not even negotiations, just sit down and talk, find a way of mitigating some of this, the worst aspect of this war, prevent escalation, but no, nothing. If there's an OSCE meeting, the Europeans stand up and they walk out of the room. So it's this is the contrast. They think this is an expression of their moral high ground, but the rest of the world now is increasingly seeing it as the Europeans becoming more or less savages. This is just very disgusting behavior.
Yes, but I think every decent European wants peace. Every decent European. Okay, you spoke with Professor Jeffrey Sachs after his speech at the European Parliament. He talked about Europe. What is Europe's main mistake? Trump doesn't seem to care about it at all.
Well, I can't tell what Professor Sachs thinks the main mistake is. Of course, I think, in his speeches there, which is also what I want to talk to him, was some of the comments, some of the rhetoric that the Europeans have fallen for, which is the idea that, we can't talk to Ukraine. Now we can't talk to Russia anymore without Ukraine in the room, which is very strange, especially for the United States. If you want to prevent if you want arms treaties, prevent the nuclear escalation, also in Europe, if you want to discuss the wider European security architecture, surely it's possible to talk to Russia without focusing on the worst part of the relationship, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And also this idea, he also pointed out that the most natural thing in the world now is NATO expansion, this open door policy, that this is somehow the recipe for a stable world order, that you just have a military bloc should be able to expand everywhere, and Russia should have no say. Again, this from my perspective is absurd, because if Russia doesn't have an institutional veto, if it can't say no, stop, or we should have a say in how European security architecture is formed, if they're not given this veto in an institution, they're gonna have to rely on a veto in the form of military power, and that's what we've seen. It would be as if Russia would set up military base in Mexico. If America doesn't have a way of saying no diplomatically, then America would say no with its military. This is just the reality of the world. But somehow we assume that by purging Russia from all main European institutions, that it should have no say whatever in Europe, that is the largest country in Europe, should have no say in Europe, that somehow Russia would just capitulate and drift into Asia and go away. This is it's absurd, and it created a very dangerous situation. But from my perspective, I think the biggest mistake of Europe has been the failure to adjust to this new international distribution of power. That is, after the Cold War, the Americans effectively sold the idea of a unipolar world order that is global primacy, and they offered more or less a partnership to the Europeans. So the Europeans had a a goal, if you will. That is, you have a collective West which dominates the world. The collective West consists of two equal pillars, the US and the EU. This was the dream. However, now we're shifting towards a multipolar world, and the United States can't be everywhere anymore because there's too many other large great powers. It can't contain the Russians, Chinese, Iranians. It has to prioritize. If it tries to be everywhere, it will exhaust its resources, and it will incentivize the other great powers to collectively balance America. So what should America do? Well, the only sensible thing is, because now they're running into bankruptcy and provoking a war with the great powers, they should really start to prioritize. So America's seeking to focus more on the Western Hemisphere, that is its own neighborhood, and also Asia, because China is seen to be its main rival. But if it goes there, it has to deprioritize something. And that's what Pete Hegseth said. Europe is no longer a key priority, at least not the main priority. And this is why they're pulling out of Europe. Now, what should Europe do in such a situation when there's a multipolar distribution of power occurring, where the Americans have less to offer Europe, but they will demand more loyalty from us in terms of political loyalty and also economic loyalty? We should diversify. Of course, have best possible relations with America, but also connect more with India, China, Russia, other centers of power. But we're doing the exact opposite. We're trying to revive our own stock value or market value for the Americans by saying, no, we'll be even more obedient now. We'll do whatever you want, and we're cutting ourselves off Russia, China. We'll only have America. So as a result, our economies are less competitive. We're becoming less relevant in the world. We're becoming more fragmented within, and all of this is happening at the time when America wants to go somewhere else. Look at my country in Norway. We used to have a sensible policy. We deterred the Soviets during the Cold War by being part of NATO, but we didn't want any foreign troops on our soil because we didn't want to provoke the Russians. So we had a balance between deterrence and reassurance. Now the government has gone off the rails. It's gonna now have littered the whole country with American military bases, because the only thing now security means is to deter. We don't consider ourselves possibly imposing a threat on anyone. And then we're hoping that this will increase our value for the Americans. Look, we'll do anything you say. Please stay. And I think this is also why the Europeans are so worried that the Ukraine war might end, because if America can get out of Ukraine, they will get out of Europe. And then Europe's relevance keeps collapsing even further.
So did Trump outsmart Europe? He said the European Union was formed in order to screw the United States. But now I'm president, so he announced 25% tariffs on the EU. Do you have a bad feeling about this?
Well, it's he's right and wrong. I think it wasn't established to screw over America. I think, as I said, I think a key objective in the 90s was to have parity with the Americans, because when you have all these individual smaller member states, and a lot of the European countries are small to medium size, they don't really have, they can be overrun completely by the United States. So it was seen as a way for the EU to use its collective bargaining power, again, to stand equally next to the United States. Now, when you use collective bargaining power, the whole purpose is that you should negotiate from a more favorable position when you're dealing with your opponents. And so I think this is the strength of the EU, that this is why it could be a good thing if it has more parity with the US, China. Otherwise, whenever it would negotiate, it can't negotiate any good deals. So I think that from this perspective, it's yes, it was made to have a stronger position against the Americans, but to screw over the Americans, it's no, I wouldn't. It's well, the whole phrase, it implies some belligerent intentions. I think the Europeans were looking to strengthen their own position, and again, this was a good thing when the Europeans looked after the national interests. Once the EU can't deliver tangible benefits to its member states anymore, then it will start to fall apart. And I think this is probably what's risks happening now, that the EU has become a burden for Europe instead of a benefit. Europe, where they're trying to sabotage the trade agreements with China when Germany desperately needs it. It's an EU where we have a foreign policy chief which doesn't believe in diplomacy, which says, I don't talk to Russia, they're war criminals. I mean, this is an absurd Europe. One where, when the British want to leave, instead of using a carrot, it's only a whip, where we're willing to have mutual harm just to deter others from leaving. It's not a great Europe. They should go back to the basics, which is sovereignty maximizers. That is, accept, the EU having some, transfer some sovereignty, and in return, we're able to negotiate better deals for you and strengthen each European country. This is what the EU should do, and instead it's become an appendage to the US empire, and no longer acting in European interest. But I do agree. I do think Trump sees the EU as a problem, and this is worth noting, because I do think it's going to put the Europeans up against each other, and he might seek to weaken it. Why have allies with a spine when you can have vassals? And I think America prefers vassals. This is not a Trump thing. This is an American thing. And it's always been like this.
Yes, but is this the end of the West we know?
I think so. I think the West, as we know, developed under very unique circumstances. That is, after World War II, the world had a very unique distribution of power and ideologies. We had two centers of power, the US and Soviet Union. They organized the world between them. They were organized around two incompatible ideologies. And due to this, during the Cold War, this need for cooperation, internal solidarity, it prevented a lot of the rivalry between. And the Europeans, of course, were overwhelmingly dependent on the United States, not just for its economy, but also for security. And the Americans were able to convert that security dependence into political loyalties. And also it prevented too much economic statecraft being used belligerently against each other, because everyone wanted to keep tensions low in the West, because we had a communist adversary. Now, I think after the Cold War, it all changed. Now our main opponents, they're not communist countries decoupled from market forces. No, they're operating in the same capitalist system. And also you see now that there's more centers of power. The interest of the Europeans and the Americans, they will diverge to a greater extent. And I don't think we appreciate this anymore. I think we became in Europe too ideological. That is, we only speak in values, because if it's values, it means every foreign policy issue can be framed as either being good or evil. And we can, if there is any dissent, we can just shame all dissent as evil. So we see this now, for example, with the war. Hungary, they're far right. Slovakia, far right. If Czech goes the same way, then they also be far right. So anyone who doesn't fall in line can be delegitimized and say they're not relevant anymore. Now, I think this is a very temporary and dangerous solution, because over time our interests are too different. So this ability to uphold a political West, which has the same internal cohesion, I just don't see it happening. I think it will fragment more and more, and whether or not it's good or bad, it's you can put some in both columns, but it's just a reality. I don't see how this can be restored. I think Biden wanted to restore it. He framed all world events as being conflict between liberal democracies and authoritarianism. This very simplistic heuristics aim to dumb down everything to a conflict between good and evil. And this was a good way of making sure that the Western bloc remained cohesive. But it's no longer in the interest of the United States either to divide the world into these two camps, because then you have the US and a weakened Europe, and then you have all these other great powers on the other side. And we see even our key friendly countries like India doesn't want to be a part of this, liberal democratic block against the rest. It's just it means subordination to the US. It means they're cutting themselves off from important centers of power. So no country, no real parts of the world outside Europe wants this anymore. So it's gonna end, and it's in Europe we're gonna fight, we're gonna kick and scream, we're gonna say anyone who deviates is a right-wing or left-wing extremist, or a Putinist, or a secret Russian agent. But while we kick and scream, it's still gonna fragment, and we're gonna go into this new world very, very unprepared.
Romanian presidential candidate Georgescu was arrested and quickly released. Is it public pressure or something else?
Well, this is the funny part. It might be coming from the United States if there's some pressure. Again, Vice President J.D. Vance actually, as we know in Munich, he devoted part of his speech to the problems now in Romania. And but I'm not sure about all the details. I thought I read somewhere that he had been imposed some that he's not allowed to talk to media or post on social media. So effectively, they silenced him. And but of course, this is a scandal. It's they had a presidential election. It didn't go the way they wanted. So they annulled the results. They tried to blame it on some Russian interference, but there's no evidence for this. On the contrary, there's evidence there has been no Russian interference. And but still, they annulled the elections, and now, of course, it's taken by police, and again, possibly given orders not to speak to media anymore. So, but this is a new trend. It's we saw, well, not the same, but similar events on the borderline between the West and Russia. So in Moldova, what happened there? They had an election, but the election was effectively determined to a large extent by Moldovans abroad. They set up these polling stations all across every country where Moldovans abroad are, except the main country where the most Moldovans are, which is Russia, where they set up, I think, 2 polling booths, and they made it, so I would think it's very reasonable to say the Moldovan election was rigged with EU support. And then, of course, you have Georgia, who say, yes, we would love to be a part of the EU, but we're not going to be a frontline against the Russians. We don't want to be another Ukraine. And we attempted to instigate a coup there using this fake NGOs. So I think it's a very dangerous situation. I think the values we argue that, and which I think we should stand up for, are being instrumentalized and thrown away in this geopolitical rivalry, and it's very unnecessary, I think.
Talking about the geopolitical situation, you have recently said from international law to the rules-based international order. What does this mean?
Well, I thought it was an interesting development over the past few years, which has been that our political leaders less and less talk about international law, and they replace this with the rhetoric of a rules-based international order. And often they use these terms, they exchange them as if they're synonyms, that they mean the same. And I just criticize this because they're very, very different. Indeed, I argue that the rules-based international order, which sounds wonderful, who doesn't want rules, who doesn't want order, but it's actually undermining international law. And it's often presented very simplistic. That is, we have international law in accordance to the UN Charter, then plus humanitarian law, that is focus on the individual rights, democracy, human rights. Again, who doesn't want this system? The problem is that human rights law and international law often introduce very contradictory principles. So, for example, international law, you're not allowed to interfere in domestic affairs of other countries. Well, if you're promoting humanitarian law, you want to support democracy, freedom in other countries. So you not only should, but you have almost an obligation to interfere in other countries, to interfere in their elections. We see the same with the use of force. In international law, very clear, you can't use military force against other countries. But under humanitarian ideas, it says, well, you can have humanitarian interventions if you're worried about the safety of people in other countries. And of course, as very relevant now is snatching territories from other countries, that is changing borders by force. This is, international law. It says, no, territorial integrity is absolute. You can't, take other countries' territory. But under these humanitarian ideas, you can say, well, self-determination surely is reasonable. Why shouldn't Taiwan have self-determination? Why shouldn't Kosovo have self-determination? So everyone should secede. And so which rule apply? When is it territorial integrity? When is it self-determination? And who gets to decide? And the West, we already said who decides. We decide because we are the champions of liberal democracy. Surely the Chinese and Russians aren't allowed to have humanitarian interventions or sever the territories of other countries because they're not allowed to use this humanitarian argument because they're not considered to be liberal enough. So it's a new system where there's one set of rules for the West and another set of the rules for the rest. So in the West, we demand that others respect international law completely, while in the West, we've given ourselves a clause of exception. We're saying, no, we can change things. We can exempt ourselves from international law because we're serving a common good, these higher liberal democratic values. So when the Chinese and Russians are saying, oh, well, we completely reject the rules-based international order, first of all, there are no rules which you can refer to. This is not because they hate rules. It's not because they hate the order. It's because this is seen as a direct attack on international law. And it goes back. It's a system of sovereign inequality. And we had this already in the past. When the Europeans in colonial era, we considered sovereignty to be for us because we are the civilized ones. When we went out in the world, we said, well, now we're in the jungle. These are the barbarians. They do not qualify for sovereignty because they're not civilized enough. So we're one rule for us and one for them. This is I refer to it as George Orwell's Animal Farm, that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. This is the rules-based international order, and this is why it's rejected very fiercely in many corners of the world.
George Orwell was a great guy.
Love him, yeah.
So we should learn from history, right? You mentioned your country, Norway. Norway has decided to host at least 12 US military bases on its soil. On the other hand, Finland and Sweden joined NATO. So we have the militarization of Scandinavia. Is this situation a peace challenge too? Is this a threat to peace?
Well, I think so, because traditionally, we have to ask what creates conflict and what creates security. This is really the point of departure in international security. And what used to be a consensus is the security conflicts primarily derived from security competition. That is the security dilemma. That is, we would like more and more security in Norway. So, okay, or Scandinavia, let's just have a lot of missiles here pointing at the Russians, some American military bases, and now we'll feel more secure. But obviously this reduces the security of the Russians, and now they have to respond and put their own weapon systems on our borders. So this is how security competition eventually diminishes security for both sides. This is why peace often demands recognizing mutual security concerns and finding solutions such as reducing the military presence along the borders to improve common security. The problem is, after the Cold War, we rejected this completely. We said we're going to have a hegemonic peace, in which the US and the manifestation of it in Europe would be NATO expansion to be so dominant. It doesn't matter if we ignore Russian security because there's nothing they can do. We said this very explicitly. All our leaders, not all, but a lot of our leaders said this very clearly in the 90s. This was the format. And so in Scandinavia, we seem to be embracing this idea now at the very time when the Americans are planning to pull out of Europe. So it's and of course, shift focus away from Europe. So it's a very strange thing to do. And as I said before, in the past, Scandinavia was considered a region of peace, stability during the Cold War as well, simply because the Swedes and Finns, they weren't part of NATO, and this gave a bit of a buffer state between the East and West, so they wouldn't have military tensions. And of course, Norway was considered to be NATO light. That is, yes, part of NATO, but no troops on our soil and no much, avoid the British and Americans sailing the warships in the north, that is in the Arctic. And from this, the Russians didn't feel threatened. So, you had some stability. But now, of course, we decided everything has to be deterrence. So we took Finland, the largest border of the Europeans against the Russians, and this was the greatest success story of neutrality. And we converted it into the biggest front line against Russia. And this is so I think Scandinavia is going to become a conflict zone in the future. And I think for the Russians, it's if you look at the Russian history, ever since the collapse of Kiev and Rus, their main concern for hundreds of years was their lack of access to reliable maritime transportation corridors. And they have 3 on their western borders, which is the Arctic, the Baltic Sea, and the Black Sea. Ukraine was, much like in the mid-19th century, was intended to expel the Russians from the Black Sea. And now with this expansion of NATO in Scandinavia, you see the possibility of making, as the Poles and the Balts often say, to make the Baltic Sea a NATO lake. You had the former NATO Secretary General saying that we can put a blockade on St. Petersburg in the future. We can put increasing pressure on Kaliningrad. So this is security through dominance. We're going to put a gun so close to Russia's head that they won't dare to do anything. This is the recipe now for security, and it's ridiculous. The Russians aren't going to capitulate. And of course, since Norway putting all these bases there, the Americans are very open that this is to confront the Russians in the Arctic. But in the Norwegian media, the politicians, they refuse to even refer to them as bases. They call them, I'm not sure how to translate it, but something assigned territories, or we refuse to call them bases because then we have to accept a discussion where we put foreign bases on our soil. So instead of accepting reality, we just invent a new language. As you said, a key focus by George Orwell. The language becomes more dishonest when there's no longer a willingness to accept reality as it is. And when you ignore reality as it is, usually very terrible things will happen. And I think this will happen in Scandinavia as well.
So war is peace.
Yes, this
in
is
Orwell's language.
Also NATO language now. Against Stoltenberg, weapons are the path to peace. Diplomacy is dangerous. So this is where we are.
How is life in Norway today? Are you feeling the economic crisis, inflation?
Well, inflation, I think, is one can see it. The Norwegian government, I think, is very eager to spend a lot of money now on war. But overall, I think the Norwegian government has an example of money. Because of oil, gas, Norway doesn't suffer to the same extent that other Europeans are struggling. That is, if you pour some oil over the problems, it tends to help to go away. Furthermore, the war in Ukraine has given a bit of a windfall for Norway as well, because the two main competitors for exporting gas in Europe are Russia and Norway. With Russia cut out of the deal, and Norway prospers a lot. So interestingly enough, the day after Nord Stream was blown up, there was a new inauguration of a new gas pipeline going from Norway down to Poland on the day after, which so it's we do benefit from some of this, I guess, economically. So again, there's problems here too with inflation, but it's I don't think it's comparable to what's happening on other parts of the continent.
And my final question, what do you think will happen in the future in Europe, in this part of Europe and the world? Ukraine, European Union, Russia, USA? Well,
I think the way I see it, at least, and I published a book 4 years ago called Europe as the Western Peninsula, Greater Eurasia, because I made the point that in a multipolar world, the Europeans can't isolate themselves in an Atlantic bloc. They also have to reach out to the rest of the world. So doing it in this Greater Eurasian format could be a positive way to have to adjust to multipolarity. But I don't think Europe is doing this. I think it's making itself less and less relevant, and it's going to start to fragment a bit from within. And the United States obviously has an interest to pivot to Asia. This is not a Trump thing. It's not a Biden thing. It began with Obama, simply because they are responding to the multipolar distribution of power which is coming. So America is leaving. The Russians, they want to restore some of the relationship with America, but they're not really interested in Europe anymore. And so since 2014, the Russians have been working very hard on reorganizing their economy to the east. So I think in the future, all their economic ties will go east, while all their weapons will be pointing west for deterrence. So this is what we have in Europe. We have a continent which is redivided again by expanding a military bloc. It's been remilitarized. We have war on our continent. Europe didn't really digitalize properly, get technological sovereignty in this new industrial revolution we're in. I think we're very poorly prepared for the years to come. And it seems like we covered up all of this with ideological slogans. So why everything we do is good, and everyone who disagrees with us are evil. And again, politicians, academics, journalists, anyone who comes with a critical voice can be said to undermine our liberal values. And so there's no course correction, I think. So I'm very pessimistic on Europe. I hope I'm wrong. As a European living in Europe, I remember in the 90s I had great hopes that Europe would become united. That is, we would, much like Germany and France after World War II, we would now have with the Russians. But this was not meant to be. So now we had. Now I think in a divided Europe, the Russians will be more dependent on China than it otherwise would have been, and Europe will be more dependent on the U.S., even though the U.S. doesn't want to be here anymore. So it's again, things can turn around, but we need a different political class with some political imagination beyond this moral sloganeering about why the Russians are so evil and Trump is so stupid, and thinking that we're still the center of the world. I think it's very dangerous.
So what a times to be alive.
Yes, as the Chinese say, interesting times, which is not a positive thing.
Okay. Professor Diesen, thank you very much for this interview.
Oh, thank you so much, Renan. I appreciate it.
Wish you all the best. Thank you once again.